Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Recently, the Distributist made a video called Atheist Hacks, where hacks was in the sense of people who are doing a shtick without knowing what actually makes it work, and without, being really particularly good at it. They just are sort of hacking away at it. It's kind of the metaphor that meaning of hacks came from. So he's talking about it in that sense. And he mentions a number of people, some of whom I've had occasion to actually come into contact with. And I think that he was a little bit overly harsh on the Atheist Hacks. Not very, mind you. It's an excellent video, by the way, that I strongly recommend watching. I link in the description. But the Atheist Hacks are hacks for a reason. That is to say, it's not purely a degenerate thing. It's not just, I think, a money grab. And in particular, also, it doesn't just speak of people who, the audiences who watch them, who have, no taste and no sense and so on. Because I think what the Distributist refers to as the Atheist Hacks, you could call them false philosophers or pseudo-philosophers or something. Pardon this cough. It's going to go away eventually. Oh, they're symptoms, just dumb cough. Anyway, so the thing about the Atheist Hacks is that they serve a purpose to their audience. And they serve, I believe, an emotional purpose to their audience. Because, if you look at their material, and it doesn't really matter which, and you look at, and especially if you filter it by which is the popular stuff, because, sometimes some of them will actually try to do something other than the standard atheist video. It's just a lack of belief, you moron! How could you not know it's a lack of belief? You're so stupid, etc. That type of video. Those are the ones that typically, amongst the Atheist Hacks, get the most views. So if you filter by that, what gets the most views? Because, occasionally they'll try experiments in other things that aren't just doing that. And, it's typically not nearly as popular. So why is it that this popular stuff is so incredibly similar? Because this is a topic my friend Gabriel Murphy had talked with me about a little bit. Like, why it's so... Because he's mentioning one in particular thing. It's just so boring. Sure, it's got some frustrating elements, but it's just boring. It's the same stuff over and over and over again. And, he brought up the question, more than once, of when are people going to get tired of just the same thing? And, well, there's an element, too, the similarities between, how every video is kind of the same thing, just warmed over and over again. That's not unique to atheism by any means. You'll see this in any sort of really anti-movement. You see the same thing in anti-feminism. You see the same thing all over the place, I presume in anti-patriarchy videos, etc., that it's, criticisms of a thing will tend to always be basically the same criticism over and over. Yet, these are very popular. And I do think, by the way, this should be distinguished a little bit from the Mystery Science Theater 3000 format. I'm a big Mystery Science Theater 3000 fan, by the way. I've got like 26 boxed sets of them. So, yeah, anyway... so I'm a really big fan of that format, and it's the Mystery Science Theater 3000 format. For those who don't know, originally Joel and the Bots, then later Mike and the Bots. So 3 characters watching a movie in a movie theater where a mad scientist put them in here, forcing them to watch the movies, attempting to find the worst movie ever that can crush every person's spirits so they can use it to conquer the world. That's the premise. The show consists of these 3 poking fun at, ribbing, and making jokes at the movie to try to keep their sanity as they get through. So it's all about making fun of movies, and especially bad movies, and that's fun. And it's a sort of exercise that sharpens the wit. There is, interestingly, and this kind of relates to the Atheist Hacks, one weakness that you see, and it's fairly clear here, and it relates over, and that weakness is that one joke that's just so tempting is the "oh, kill me now, why am I watching this" sort of thing. I can't believe I have to watch this. It's so terrible. Now, they could get away with that on actual Mystery Science Theater 3000 as long as they didn't overuse it, because the character was, in theory, forced to watch the movie. The plot in Mystery Science, they were in a satellite, and the plot being that the air was pulled out of every room except for the movie theater when the experiment was being run. And so they literally had to be in the movie theater. They couldn't be anywhere else. And so that joke kind of worked because they were being, within the fictional context, literally forced to watch. Even there, they couldn't push it too much. And in other stuff that they did, like riff tracks and several others, they were tempted to use that same joke, but it simply doesn't work because, well, it's voluntary. I mean, you're watching this because you signed up to watch it. You're making money by watching it. Ultimately, that sort of criticism of why am I watching this thing if you're doing this for money or to entertain an audience is a criticism not of really of the movie, but of your audience, since they're the ones actually making you do it. Okay, so you see that, same thing in all sorts of YouTube anti-stuff, be it, the one I'm most familiar with, the most talking about really is the atheistic, anti-theist type videos, anti-atheism criticism videos, and so on. Those things often will have that same thing, and it gets really, really overviews. Like, I can't believe I have to tell you this. Well, you don't. Just ignore it. Works just fine. You don't see most things that most Christians write, so yeah, there you go. And the same thing. There are tons of atheists. They write tons of things. I ignore virtually all of it. I don't even hear of virtually all of it. I ignore plenty of the stuff I do hear about because it's the same old thing, in my case. But you can just ignore stuff. And so complaining about the fact that you're not ignoring something is, not very entertaining. But that sort of thing, I'm using that as to represent that style of moaning and complaining aside. Criticizing something can really sharpen your wit. You have to move quickly, you have to react, and seeing one thing against another can often really help to teach you about both things because you see how they respond. This is why the way that you tell who's the best boxer is not by like having them punch a punching bag and seeing how they, analyzing their form and so on. It's you have them fight each other because in the moment you really see what actually works. It's very instructive. Well, the same thing, any martial art, sparring. The same thing is true of arguments. That like when two people are pushing, it teaches you something. Now, the actual debate format, which I've been critical of in the past, I don't think is particularly useful because the debate format, it's not good for things where they're overly large disagreements because the debate really just needs to get down to some, to the actual source of the disagreement, not the epiphenomenal disagreements that just, all logically flow from the distinct premises, at which point, when you've got two completely incompatible premises, all you can do is say, like, I've got this premise, and you reject that premise and accept some other premise. And then you're done. Because it's a premise, you can't really argue your premises. Things like, does reason work? If one person says, reason does work, you can actually get at truth through reason, and the other person says, no, reason does not work, try it. You'll just come up with, whatever random results may be true, may not be. You can't rely on it in any way. Well, that person can't produce a rational argument that reason doesn't work. And I mean, he couldn't consistently anyway, because there'd be no point in trying. And the other person cannot possibly reason the person who denies reason into believing in reason because he denies the very tool that you'd be using to try to get him to believe in it. There's no actual debate to have. Okay, so I'm not talking about debate for that and other reasons, but let that suffice for now. I'm talking about, however, criticism still has this sort of steel sharpens steel effect to it, because in criticism and looking at what somebody said and then criticizing it, it's a way of bringing things into focus and making you address a specific point when you're looking at, when you're looking at what the person said. And so that, I think, is why this format is so appealing even outside of pure entertainment. But that's not really what the Atheist Hacks are doing, because they're doing this same thing over and over again. I mean, really, really intensely the same thing. And again, not just Atheist Hacks, hacks of any kind where you're doing anti-stuff. I've not that I've watched much anti-feminist content, but I've heard Teal, for example, talking about all the anti-feminist comment that consists of just saying, like, you're a moron! You're such a moron! You're an idiot! I can't believe you're so dumb, you moron! And he criticizes this, and I think reasonably so, for having no actual content. It's just a person yelling at another person who's not there. But that stuff, that yelling at a person who's not there, or talking calmly and saying the same sort of insults, etc., which is, I think, a large portion of what the Distributist, calm or less calm, talked about as atheist hacks. What does the hack really consist of? And I think it's here where you see primarily what it is that he's talking about in that stuff. And it forms a rather large amount of the material you can find, in part because it's easy, and here's sort of, we really are bringing things into focus. It serves a purpose for its viewers. It's not an intellectual debate, but, and I'm going to use the Atheist Hacks because, domain specific. This portion becomes domain specific. It'll be different for anti-patriarchy, for anti-feminism, for anti-republican, for anti-democrat, etc. For every anti-thing, they're going to have their own particular needs that they fulfill. And when you come to the Atheist Hacks, the Distributist hit on one of the big things that you find is a lot of it is designed, if you look at it, to try to make the audience who agrees with the person speaking feel smart. It's largely insulting people for being stupid for disagreeing with the thing held in common between the viewer and the host. And that's not the only technique, there are a bunch, but a lot of them do revolve around that, around feeling smart. The other thing, though, and the Distributist didn't hit on this, is that they also, the host is being extremely assertive, extremely confident. And so I think the other major component here, in what the Distributist called the Atheist Hack type video, is not just vicarious feeling of intelligence, whatever exactly feeling smart means. And the other part of it is vicarious confidence. Because confidence is extremely contagious. A person who is confident and on your side makes you feel so much better about being on your side, about yourself. And it's that latter part that I think is really the big thing. Because if you think about, this is something that Christians in the modern West, and especially in America, serious Christians in the sense of Christians who think that the religion is more important than the culture, not the other way around. Who hold this as a belief, and to some degree at least, if not act on it necessarily in the sense of being a saint, but at least act on it in the sense of trying to order their lives accordingly. That the religion, that God is more important than man, religion more important than mere culture. And by the way, it's generally held, if this isn't clear, that in having this right relationship, you actually value the second thing even more than you would if you got this relationship wrong. Because getting this relationship wrong tends to eventually result in things like narcissism and so on. People become tools, and you can't really love them because you don't have a right relationship to them. And having that right relationship, in subordinating them to something more important, everything in the world becomes much more important. So that's not holding things to be unimportant, just getting the hierarchy of being correct. Anyway, so I'm using serious Christian to mean somebody who is trying to do that, sincerely trying to do that. Okay. Sincere Christians generally feel very much like a minority. And, well, it's because we are. But all the more, culture is fairly obviously turning far against this in a way that it hadn't been as much, say, we tend to be so inclined to say 50 years ago, but 50 years ago is 1967. You're talking about the free love movement. 50 years ago was not all that Christian a time, at least in the United States. It's right after World War II in Europe, with all sorts of despair from the destruction of World War II setting in. So 100 years ago, 150 years ago, people had their sins, to be sure, but they did at least tend to acknowledge this ordering of things, even if they didn't, act in a moral sense according to it. That's largely gone away. We are clearly entering, more of what one could easily call an atheist, a secular wasteland, roughly speaking, where the correct ordering of things is wildly out of proportion, and what's most important is oneself, etc. So we tend to feel pretty isolated. We tend to feel like, secularism is very much in the ascendancy and so on. And that's not wrong, But that's not, if you talk to atheists, you find that's not really their perspective. I mean, some of them will talk about how religion's going away and atheism is winning, and it's the triumphal march of progress, etc. Like, some of them will talk about that, but for a very large number of them, they don't. They talk, and even when they do talk this way, by the way, they very often speak in the reverse way too. Richard Dawkins, there's a while ago, made a rant video about him. And the video I was watching in there was kind of fascinating. I think I criticized him for this in the rant. But he had talked about how they had various, they were winning, that their opponents had no arguments, only fear-mongering. And then he went on to fear-monger, like seconds later, talking about, it was incredibly trivial stuff, too. Like, there was some board in Kansas, and this is a number of years old. There's like a school board in Kansas who wanted to teach creation science and couldn't, or something like that. For those who aren't familiar, I'm Catholic. I think evolution is probably how God created the species. Anyway, you just have to throw caveats in here. The internet's a low context place, so my apologies to those who know. Anyway, so to pick up the thread, he went immediately from triumphalism straight into fear-mongering. And now, of course, the fear-mongering is very necessary for fundraising and so on, because nobody contributes to people who have won and don't need to do anything. Okay, but nonetheless, it still psychologically works for the audience, I mean, based on the reaction. Because as much as they feel like they're in the triumphal, march of progress, they still see all sorts of things that are not ordered, where the world is not ordered according to how they would order it, were they in charge of it. And, especially for atheists, their go-to explanation tends to be religion. Being in charge of this. And when you can't, you just declare your atheistic opponent to have a pseudo-religion or false religion, or their atheism is really a religion. Like feminism is a religion, or Marxism is a religion, despite being officially atheist. Whatever. But the point is, psychologically speaking, they tend to do this. And so they do not think of themselves as being in this triumphal position. For as much as, the Distributist frequently talks about the decline of Western civilization, many of us do, because it's fairly obvious to us that the Western civilization is fairly rapidly declining. That's not the way the atheists view it. Because, what we view as declining, the atheist view as an ascendancy of, the triumph of secularism and hedonism and the liberation of the individual to go and sin as much as he likes. Asterisk, that's not what they mean. Asterisk, it is what they mean, and they'll never sort it out. Whatever. But again, looking at this picture, they tend to, look out in a world where people do things like wish each other Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays, and people complain about this, and there are people who are trying to, live according to their principles. And if you look around, there are actually tons of hospitals are actually Catholic hospitals. And all these things are deeply irksome to the atheist, because this is from their perspective, wrong ordering of the world. And in fact, it is quite common to find things like you'll drive along the highway and you'll see a cross there where somebody died. And it's not that any given one is really, they're the angry ones, but most of them are not, so angry that they really begrudge somebody who lost a child, some small act of, remembrance of their child. Most of them are not that petty by any means. But on the other hand, it is still nonetheless just a kind of, drumbeat of, this is not how the world would be if things were ordered the way I think they should be. And so all of those things put together produce a feeling of the world being massively out of joint, out of place, not ordered correctly. Moreover, and this is, really bring it into what does the Atheist Hack video do for such a person, especially because most people are not all that intelligent. Most people are not in the top 1% of the population, definitionally. And there are an awful lot of atheists who are not specially bright people, because most of humanity is not specially bright. And so they're not really well equipped to deal with these things. And this is one of the problems of the common good generally. One of the problems brought up by free speech and pluralistic society is that human beings aren't built for a pluralistic society. I mean, if you look at like the number of faces we can remember and things like that, the number of relationships we can, keep actively, maintaining, it's actually not that high, and it's really, much better suited. Most people, they're in bell curve for this thing, much better suited to like small tribal environments. A village, where you have to keep track of, 1 to, 50 people, 100 people, something in that range. You need to maintain relationships in a more extended sense with, 2, maybe 300 people, and that being your world, like your entire world is made up primarily of those people, is what human beings generally deal best with. And most people deal best with the sort of hierarchical family structure that you get in these sorts of tribes, where you have the elders who then do a lot of the thinking for the younger people, and eventually, they age into it if they survive, etc. But like, you get trained for dealing with the complexities of the world over the course of decades. In our modern Western society, where the generations, the individual is atomized, the generations are cut off from each other, there is no universally recognized authorities of any kind, there isn't even really universally, respected people. Scientists sort of a little bit, athletes and actors sort of a little bit sometimes. But other than that, like it's so different from what people need that most of them can't handle it. Most people are not built to do the sort of research and studying, to be able to come up with quick answers, to be able to feel like they could vanquish people in an argument. And lots of people do get into it. All it takes, in a week, say, as an atheist, is, find, one pushy, Christian aunt or something who, just pushes a little bit, like, why don't you believe in God? It's just obvious. And coming up with the sort of standard thing, if in the mouths of the average atheist who isn't all that bright, like, well, I just don't see enough evidence. And, well, of course there's enough evidence. I mean, just look at the world. Can't you see it? If you're not fast on your feet, the average atheist isn't going to have a good answer. Most of these people are going to encounter things, not that specifically, but, just using that as sort of a symbol of the various things that will make the atheist feel less than completely adequate, less than completely confident, might be a better way of putting it. And here's where the Atheist Hack videos come in. They're the same thing over and over because they fulfill an emotional need. Because they are essentially a replenishment. That you have the atheist who has gone through the week, and every week grinds you down. That's the nature of life. The world grinds you down. And of course the atheist has no supernatural source of replenishment, to build himself up again. So he's got to have something in the world that does it. And this is one of the big functions of the Atheist Hack videos. Because, the world by and large doesn't tend to make you feel very smart. I mean, there's a self-selection factor here. If, however smart you are, you tend to go and find challenges that are, reasonably appropriate to, like that reasonably challenging, such that you're always being challenged. So if you're not very smart, you won't take on very big challenges. If you are much smarter, you'll take on bigger challenges. People sort themselves, partially like the sort of job that you have and so on, etc. So it grinds you down. It makes you feel like, there are a bunch of times when you could have said something much more clever and you didn't think of it, or you just didn't have a good response to something, or, what have you. And then, comes along the Atheist Hack video, and here's the guy that you identify with. You're a fan of him or her. They're on your side. And so there's that, immediate sort of identification. Videos have a very personal sort of nature to them. You feel like you get to know somebody over time. There's almost like a synthetic friendship that builds up, although it's, fairly illusory. But it's really weird, that there are people that if you got into a conversation with them, all sorts of things about them, and they know nothing whatsoever about you. But that doesn't normally happen, apart from modern technology. You don't normally, find out, mannerisms and in more intimate details and so on about a person outside without, any sort of, interaction with them outside of modern technology. And so we're not built to recognize that. We're built to, the level of intimacy is generally set, either one of those things, how much they know about you, how much you know about them, generally tends to indicate the other. And so we tend to assume it and have to remind ourselves, etc. But all that, works to the benefit of identification, the viewer with the thing they're watching. And so, what happens? Well, the person who doesn't feel very smart is made to feel smart because, here is the person who is, possibly with the benefit of editing, making really good points right on time with good timing. And then also they're made to feel confident. The world grinds you down, and, here's that person you identify with, this sort of synthetic friend who's just really sure of themselves. Like, they are confident about every last thing. And that other person who criticized you, they're an idiot. I mean, the other person is kind of, you're identifying the person who criticized you with the person who criticized the atheist hack, or atheists in general, what have you. But that psychological identification makes the whole thing fulfill that need for replenishment, because you're getting that human interaction where you're getting, the grind of, day in, day out grind of life is being replenished by this. And so, yes, it's the same all the time. It's the same points. I mean, there isn't much to say about atheism is just a lack of belief. It's not an actual belief, even though I draw conclusions from the actual belief I'm saying I don't really have. Because you might actually be really, really smart, and I might be completely wrong about the world, in theory, according to me, but I'm going to call you a moron for holding your beliefs anyway, even though you might be, in theory, from what I'm saying, a moron for being completely correct, and I could have just missed why it is that you're completely correct, and I'm utterly wrong. Yeah, okay, sorry, it's hard to, that's not how they phrase it, obviously. It's hard for me to kind of, separate reality from what they're talking about. But in any event, that thing about, you moron, it's just a lack of belief. This is such a simple point. How can you not get this point? How can you be so dumb, so utterly, unimaginably stupid that you can't figure out that atheism is just a lack of belief in God, etc.? And it's the same thing. I mean, tune in next week, and how can you be so stupid to not realize it's just a lack of belief? It's nothing more than a lack of belief. How many times do I have to say that it's a lack of belief? I'm going to get out the branding irons. I'm going to shoot you in the face with a missile. You're so stupid, etc., etc. No, comedic exaggeration. Anyhow, it's the same thing over and over again. It's the same big thing, but it's an emotional purpose. And emotions don't vary. Being ground down and needing to be puffed up is the same every time. It's the same emotional need that you have. And therefore, the same emotional need generally, and over the course of years it varies, but is generally satisfied by the same thing that makes you feel better over and over again. People keep on eating food every single day. Well, yeah, it's because food fills them. And every time you feel a little short of breath, you take a breath of air, there's no variety. Well, yeah, it's because air fulfills the actual need in question. And so why is this the same constantly? It's because it fulfills that emotional need. It fulfills this core emotional requirement to be built up over having been ground down. It's a very obvious analogy to this being atheist church. Because, of course, one of the things about, weekly worship is that it helps to replenish you after having been ground down through the week. So it's not a unique need by any means. It's just this is one way in which people actually try to fulfill that need. It explains why are they hacks? Well, it actually wouldn't work very well if it was new every time. If this was serious intellectual inquiry where the topic was changing all the time, it would not, in fact, have that emotional impact because it would vary too much. It would not be the same thing. And, because if you vary the subjects, different people will get them to greater and lesser degrees. There isn't the comfort of familiarity and so on. A channel that is constantly talking about different things is not going to have that same fulfillment of emotional needs. I mean, there'll be a little bit, because same voice every time, possibly the same face or what have you, but it's not going to be the same sort of emotional comfort because, if you're not calling somebody an idiot every week, you're not, producing that stimulus of feeling like you're smarter than the people who either you're an idiot or they are. And for a while, it wasn't looking so good on them being the idiot. That sort of thing. So the hack, the atheist hack is kind of almost a necessity within this. I mean, a necessity in the sense of there is this need that will be produced by the many who aren't very good at, doing, heavy-duty intellectual work for themselves, and by everybody who just, gets emotionally worn down over time by the process of living. And so, whenever you have a strong need, there will be people who will come and fulfill it. So the atheist hack that the Distributist describes is, I mean, heck, you could call it an archetype if you want to go more in the Jordan Peterson type route. But it's really, it is something that will always recur and will always have forms. I mean, there's a, okay, so within Catholicism, you have the sacramental reason for the Mass being held every week. And, so the sermon is kind of, it's useful, but it's incidental. The real purpose is the sacramentalism within Catholicism. The same is true of, Orthodoxy and so on. Apostolic Christianity has that. But the non-apostolic Christianity still gets together every week for the sermon, even though they don't, according to themselves, don't do anything. I mean, that you couldn't do on your own. There's no, you need a priest to confect the sacraments within apostolic Christianity. But in non-apostolic Christianity, since there are no sacraments, there's no priesthood, you just have a bunch of people, they're all equal to each other, and, so why do you get together once a week to say some prayers, sing some songs, etc.? Well, because everybody getting together once a week fulfills that emotional need for community and bonding and replenishing yourself as things wear down and so on. It's a universal human need, and so it will, all communities will fulfill it in some way. There'll always be some sort of regular thing which is comfortable and familiar, although it's going to have a little bit of variety because human beings can't do exactly the same thing every week. I mean, like literally, word for word exactly in all ways. There's a need for familiarity, a need for regular familiarity that all human beings have, or virtually all human beings have. There's some people with neurological development issues who may not be in that case. But leaving that caveat aside, almost all people will have this sort of need. And as a result, there will always be people who will be there to fulfill it. It's a service that they're giving to their fellow man. So this is the way in which I think the Distributist was a little bit hard on the Atheist Hacks. Yes, I mean, the people he identified are not philosophers. They're not doing heavy intellectual work. But, at the same time, they are doing a service for their fellow creatures, even if they don't believe themselves to be created. And I think it's worth acknowledging that even though, in an absolute sense, yes, they are they aren't doing, they're doing a disservice as well because, they're reinforcing things which are false, since, Christianity is true. But that said, I think it's worth keeping in mind that they are trying to do a service. Their intention is to do a service. That is what they believe themselves to be doing, is a service. Even though it's not, a grand and lofty one. But, life isn't mostly about the grand and lofty stuff. Life is mostly about living moment to moment. And especially for a Christian, it's, I think, worth remembering that, God likes the details. God created an awful lot of time in between every second and created an awful lot of dust and an awful lot of beetles. And so, yeah, they're not doing anything grand, but most of good things in life aren't all that grand. Most of life is about the details. So, yeah, it's in a sense a very qualified defense of the Atheist Hacks. And in any event, there's something to be said for them. Anyway, God bless them all. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.